My presentation has a title which is on Being, Becoming, and Infinitesimal Calculus, which basically is the new title of the old paper of mine, which was on war, peace, and infinitesimal calculus. And this was like less precise, but also less abstract, because it referred to Tolstoy's War and Peace and the famous quote on infinitesimal calculus given there, which was this one: only by taking an infinitesimally small unit for observation, the differential of history, that is the individual tendencies of man, and attaining to the art of integrating them, that is finding the sum of these infinitesimals, can we hope to arrive at the laws of history. And this is the introductory quote, and also like link to the whole introduction, which says that in Tolstoy's War and Peace, there is a scene in which General von Clausewitz, who like many other Prussians entered Russian service during the campaign against Napoleon, appears on a horseback and takes part in the following conversation. Der Krieg muss in Raum verlegt werden, he says, since der Zweck ist nur den Feind zu schwächen, so kann man gewiss nicht den Verlust der Privatpersonen in Achtung nehmen. And Prince Andrei, who overhears this, is irritated because this extended realm is where his father and sister live, while the generals have nothing in their German heads but fear is not worth an empty eggshell. This was the quote. And this scene, like many others in the novel, reflects Tolstoy's very own philosophy of history, where Germans are described as, I quote, military theorists who believe in science of war with immutable laws, laws of oblique movements, outflanking, and so forth, end of quote. And by contrast, the Russians respect the concrete situations and people in their individuality, as witnessed by Kutuzov's irrational decisions, such as losing the Battle of Borodino and retreating far enough to allow Napoleon to take Moscow and become stranded there without supplies. It results in the famous analogy between the laws of history and those of the calculus based on the tendencies of individual men and not vice versa. And this is the opening quote, which I mentioned before. And I find this analogy instructive because it presents calculus as an alternative model of the world in motion and perpetual war, rather than in repose and peace. And such a sentiment is by no means exclusive to Tolstoy. It is echoed influential in Engels' Dialectics of Nature, with calculus extended from the laws of history to the laws of natural sciences. I quote, the differential calculus for the first time makes it possible for natural science to represent mathematically processes and not only states, motion, end of quote. And such, it is an example of general dialectics, or the science of the most general laws of all motion, which provides a solution to the dilemma of theory versus life. And in my paper, I would like to look at this dilemma as misconceived by means of the calculus itself, with reference to Hegel's science of logic, which systematically uses the calculus to achieve goals at variance with Marx and Engels. The main idea is that motion or war are not in opposition to theory and peace as some kind of true reality, but are rather part of them. And this is also, as I will conclude, what Clausewitz understood, which makes the former, or Clausewitz, unlike Tolstoy, which makes the former a true representative of modernity. I will try maybe now to, no, I am not able to use the representation. Okay. Now, there's a first section of my paper, which is called The World in Motion. While Tolstoy was mainly interested in calculus as part of mathematical education and had basically no interest in Hegel at all, Marx was enthusiastic about both, to the extent that the editors of his estate were able to collect an entire volume containing his mathematical writings, which are mostly his notes on how calculus works. Engels, as usual, was enthusiastic about Marx being enthusiastic, incorporating calculus into his dialectic of nature. I quote, Engels says, the turning point in mathematics was Descartes' variable magnitude. With that came motion and hence dialectics in mathematics, and advanced to, of necessity, the differential and integral calculus, which moreover immediately begins and which on the whole was completed by Newton and Leibniz, not discovered by them. Obviously, the link between calculus and motion was end of the quote already, is not of Engels' own invention. Newton himself developed it from his interest in physics using the vocabulary of fluents, fluxions, and flowing quantities as an explanatory tool. Still, the aim of calculus was mainly to quantify the circumferences, areas, and volumes of complicated curved shapes, such as the orbits of planets, by transforming them into simple rectangular ones. Ancient mathematics already knew this, treating the circle as a polygon with very small, perhaps infinitely so sides, but calculus brought a systematic approach to the matter by reducing the multiple cases to two complementary ones, differentiation and integration. Now, differentiation is to measure the slope of the tangent to the given curve at the point P by taking the difference in small neighborhood of P, expressing it as the ratio of very small differences. These are the sides of the so-called characteristic triangle, which roughly corresponds to the triangle between the tangent and the axis. Since the smaller the triangle, the better the ratio captures the slope of the tangent, the idea arises that the approximation is the best when the differences are as small as possible. In view of this, they should be both finite, since otherwise they cannot form a difference, yielding a nonsensical expression of 0 over 0, and less than any finite quantity, since otherwise a better approximation will be possible. A similar consideration applies to integration, where the area under the curve bounded by the x-axis is calculated. Here, the area is divided into a finite number of rectangles with the same observation that the smaller the rectangle, the better the approximation, concluding that it must be the best when the rectangles are infinitesimally small. Now, the crucial logical question is not so much how one can sum an infinite number of infinitesimally small quantities, but rather in what sense they are quantities at all. A Newton answer is famously very vague, operating with transient state in which the quantum finds itself just before disappearing. This means treating infinitesimals as both still existing and soon to be no more, justified in this conflicting quality by the very nature of motion. Now, Engels adopted this idea as not only a sufficient basis for calculus, but also for a new logic, phrasing both as follows, I quote, "First, I differentiate x and y, that is, I take x and y as infinitely small, that in comparison with any real quantity, however small, they disappear. In place of x and y, therefore, I have their negation, dx and dy, in the formulas or equations before me. I continue then operate with these formulas, treating dx and dy as quantities which are real, though subject to certain exceptional laws, and at a certain point, I negate the negation, that is, I integrate the differential formula, and in place of their x and dy, again get the real quantities x and y, and am then not where I was at the beginning. What we have here applied to calculus is the law of the double negation as articulated Anti-Dühring together with other dialectical laws, such as the transformation of quality into quantity. As the quote itself indicates, Engels feels very confident and nonchalant about these, ridiculing mathematicians who became dialecticians against their own will, and referring to the old Hegel, who is usually quite right, even on matters of calculus. Maybe I have other idea I can share. Do you see this?
Yes. And also, so, I put your text in the chat.
Do you see the whole page?
Yes.
That's good, because that's my paper. So it helps at least, you know, because what I was saying now was basically commenting on this picture. So this is the picture which captures both the idea of differentiation and the idea of integration, and what the infinitely small quantity is. Here was the quote from Engels, and I can now proceed from here, so you can basically check it visually too. What is striking is that the old Hegel thought otherwise, and explicitly so, in both mathematics and logic. And this is not because he didn't think of the world in terms of motion and conflict, but because he treated them as having a specific structure that could not be reduced to mere positive words, which is an attitude he criticized as formalism. A quick insight into what is meant can be gained from the logical fallacy he highlighted as the problem of bad infinity. First, consider the quantum as something determinate or finite, as Hegel would call it, and notice that this finiteness can easily be violated when our concepts, intentions, or theories encounter the real world, which is, so to speak, measured by them. Then, I quote here, this is what Hegel says, the infinitely small signifies in the first instance the negation of the quantum as such, that is, of the so-called finite expression of the completely determinateness that quantum as such possesses. Second, consider that it is one thing to say that this quantum is not finite, this concept is not sharp, or this justice is not perfect, and another thing entirely to let these negations represent a new quality, an infinite quantum concept or justice probably found somewhere beyond our world, and even more to claim that this is because the world is in motion and a new logic is needed to correctly describe the peculiarity. Fuzzy logic, for example, wrongly conceived as the true logic of this world, is an example of the same illusion. Now there is the section 3 called Being and Becoming. Here, sorry. It is for a variety of these interconnected conceptual reasons that the calculus appears at the beginning of the science of logic as part of analysis of the categories of being, standing for repose, and becoming, standing for motion, as well as the first justification of the core of the dialectical method, the concept of sublation. What Hegel does is recalibrate the opposition of being and becoming in accord with his idiosyncratic idea of being contaminated by negativity. He begins with the observation that saying that something is in a pure, unqualified way is empty, amounting to saying that it is not, which he represents as the identity of pure being with pure nothing. Specific being or being here is never just positively here, but always related to what it is not, or separated from it by drawing a boundary. So let me capture it like this in this picture. And this is what his motto, determinatio est negatio, also represents. It gives being here an unstable quality, since the given boundary can always be, by definition, tampered with or crossed, leading us to a new boundary and so on. Becoming, in this sense, is not an opposition to being, but rather its form, or the form of its instability. This is represented by the second figure. Grammatically speaking, one can follow Pirmin Steckler here and read this in terms of the German Wert, along with all categories that resist the formalism of the indicative mood, along with was, will be, would be, and so on. They all represent something transitory, differentiating more finely within what is and is not. But by doing this, they don't refer to a more real fluctuating world of entities such as the infinitesimals. They built on it. And this is what Hegel explicitly says, Pacey Newton, the both type is mine. These magnitudes are so determined, allegedly, that they are in their vanishing, not before this vanishing, for they would then be finite magnitudes, not after it, for then they would be nothing. Against this poor thought, it is objected and endlessly repeated, namely by Hegel, that these magnitudes are either something or nothing, that there is no intermediary state between being and nothing, and state is here an appropriate barbaric expression. We can translate it also into physical vocabulary, saying something as follows. If some object is capable of motion, then the object must be, in a sense, immovable, otherwise motion will be meaningless. And this is what the idea of infinitesimals ignores by transforming motion into the immovable object itself. Calculus then, as well as its new dialectical logic, represent a style of reasoning, I quote here, which makes and clings to the false presupposition of the absolute separateness of being and not being, and as such, I quote again, it is to be named not dialectic but sophistry. Now, after clarifying this point, we can still ask whether such a complicated device as infinitesimals was needed to show this, and the answer is yes, obviously, by deepening a parallel between the structure of infinitesimal talk, which arises from an approximative process, and the cognitive process as a series of negative determination. We can think here, for example, of theories of physics that are refuted one after another without ever reaching a definitive goal. This leaves us with two extreme positions. One is general skepticism, which stems from the possibility of negating the given boundary indefinitely, so that no fixed result of knowledge can be obtained. And the other is transcendent escapism, which posits a result in the transfinite beyond that our negations will eventually reach or at least get near to. So the truth is out there. Yeah. For Hegel, both these standpoints are conceptual traps, bad negations of each other to be overcome by immanent means. A proper understanding of the calculus and its underlying concepts provides a complex model for doing this. The basic guide here is Hegel's favorite example, which is the series 0.285 and so on, which by having no determinate goal is a case of bad conceptualization or bad infinity. This can be remedied, though, by providing its specific limit 2/7, which, as Hegel points out, is a ratio or relation. So this looks like stating the obvious, but the true extent of this reference is revealed in passages like this. I quote, "The series exhibits the contradiction inherent in it of representing something which is a relation and possesses qualitative nature within it as without relation, as a mere quantum, as amount." I read it as follows. Infinitesimals are not independent objects, but rather relations of a given series to its limit, if one exists. In view of the previous analysis, this looks obvious enough, but real insight is still to come when this relational reading is generalized. Consider this. The given series is an example of something that we know from elementary school as decimal expansion of real number. But it is a very specific case, which adopts the rational number as limit. For many, such as 3 and so on, which is the number pi, there is no such limit or ratio available, which is why they are known as irrational. It is more than a matter of historical interest that the Greeks called them allogoi logoi, irrational ratios, thus suggesting that they are ratios after all, but in a sense yet to be construed. And this is what Hegel's analysis essentially aims at. The basic technical idea was introduced by Georg Cantor and therefore could not be known to Hegel, but it fully aligns with this requirement that a series, I quote, has the determination of infinity within itself. And this is by providing the series with a limit by relating it not to something pre-given, but to itself. What Cantor did, in fact, was to take the sequence of rational numbers that was to identify some point on the real axis and to say that this point is this sequence itself. Though not just like that, but after it meets the property of thickening over all measures. The property is described here, but I will skip this and say that by making the series convergent in this immanent sense, by relating it to the inner property of thickening, the reals were finally introduced as numbers 2000 years after incommensurability was discovered as a kind of bad negation of the original theory of reals. Now, this is penultimate section. Approximation as a self-reflexive relation led us, by analogy, to the idea of knowledge as a process that directs us to its result by becoming that result itself. It is in the end a way to avoid the cliffs of skepticism and escapism, representing a process without result and a result without a process. In order not to become too abstract, just think here of everyday experience such as household chores, which children hate and try to avoid because they see them through the following partial truth. The moment one finishes cleaning, the mess is already there, thus there is no point to it in the sense of no fixed result. In adopting this, Hegel claims children are a kind of formal logicians, sticking to perpetual being, which makes them skeptical later when they leave the stability of home and become the dialecticians of perpetual becoming. The secret of chores is that they are conceived as both process and result. Besides the quality of eternal suffering, they also have the quality of work done, bringing being and becoming together. And this is how the analysis by means of relation deepens our insight into the negativity of being. As we said, some being X never arises directly, but by a separation from what it is not within the original pure being, or recursively within the network of the separations made up so far, which Hegel calls concept. The immanent point emphasizes that these separations cannot be made from the outside, as the cliffs of skepticism and escapism suggest, but from within, which redraws the underlying picture as follows. Rather than separating X from some Y from the external point Z, one must perform this operation from the original point of X itself, arriving at its separation into the proper part x and its negation y. As a relation of x to x itself, this leads us to the equation x equals x plus y. The following remarks then are to elaborate. You see that this was the first figure basically illustrates this equation. Primarily, this relation obtains between the original x and its correction by y. Becoming then is the form of knowledge expressed in the given equation, and the being is the immovable value of the given variable. Thus, second, and contrary to skeptical extreme, knowledge is possible, but not as corresponding to the pre-given world, as transcendent position claims, but to our attempts at it once they are recognized as failures. These failures, positively taken in their relation to knowledge that corrected them, make knowledge stable enough to be considered an improvement in the sense of pairs rather than of Popper, and their seemingly shared concept of verisimilitude. Such an improvement, third, cannot be measured externally, but by the entire structure's thickening in both diachronic and synchronic manner, which is hermeneutical all the way down, since one always arrives at the same point x, or the original being, that is thickened, enriched by the experience of the journey. This is depicted in the last figure. Hegel's anthropological similes substantially help here when presenting the whole picture or absolute in terms of an old man who perceives the same differences he started with as a child differently, from the perspective of his whole life. This corrects the ontological standpoint of youth and the dialectical standpoint of adulthood by a speculative attitude in which, so to speak, the form of x equals x plus y becomes identical with its contents. And I have finally reached the final section, which is this one. With all this in mind, let me revisit the initial dilemma faced as an expressive problem of talking about transient phenomena such as war, motion, and life in a static manner. If we focus on the negativity involved, we can link it to everyday situations, such as when progressive teachers persuade children that it's okay to make mistakes, having probably in mind things such as failing a math test rather than setting the school on fire. The problem then is how to describe the negative phenomena without approving them as something worth doing. Hegel is often accused of doing just that when claiming, for example, that war unites states or that fearing error is the biggest error one can commit. The given logical analysis provided a kind of resolution here. When discussing war, conflict, or mistakes, we are not referring to something incompatible with being in the exclusive sense of either or, but to something that is part of being as its form, which is becoming. The equation was to capture this through its relational form, which resists mere positive reading, without abandoning it entirely. And this consists in construing relationality not from an absolute point outside, but from one of the related parts that is self-reflexively. Tolstoy's problem with Clausewitz, with which my exposition began, lay in that Tolstoy overlooked or rather purposefully ignored the fact that Clausewitz was interested in such a stratified effort, conceiving of war not as a matter of static laws, which he explicitly criticizes as the mathematical theory, but as filled with unpredictable parameters in terms of fog of war or the frictions it is accompanied by. This led him to grasp war as a continuation of political discourse rather than an absolute phenomenon. I will skip this long quote, which basically formulates this, but will turn attention to the last sentence of it, which arguably states that war has its own grammar, but no logic. This offers a very apt summary of our problem in the following sense. War's grammar is part of everything that exists without being something simply existing or desirable, which is what the equation expresses in its generality. As a mere formula, however, it requires not only a semantic understanding, but also a kind of achievement. And this consists of reading it precisely in a self-reflexive way, applying negativity or relationality to itself. Otherwise, one will fall into the same trap as Engels did with calculus and dialectical laws by mistaking, so to speak, one's grammar for one's logic. Thank you for your attention. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you a lot, Wojciech. Well, are there any questions, please? Yeah, and we're waiting for your reply, Pirmin.
I don't have a reply. Only a short remark, Wojciech. There is a point which I would like to get a little bit clearer, because we have one point is the point of how to represent becoming, movements, time in a theoretical framework which is relational. So we have process forms which as such seem to be timeless, and then we have processes which are in time. And so how do you relate what you have said to what I would like to express as the problem of time as the real time, not as the time forms? The time forms can be expressed in generic terms or even in mathematical terms, relational, but not the time as actual. And I think it has to do with what you are saying about Clausewitz here, and I don't understand it correctly now or precisely, that Clausewitz in my reading would say, well, we can say something about the forms grammatically, but we cannot talk about the actual things. This would be at least a little bit a different reading than yours. So I just want to compare it.
You are right. Basically, I think that what is important is the following observation. But when I am talking about something, I'm talking about objects or about being, that's unavoidable. But still, I can talk about this with respect to its relational nature or its becoming as its form. So I can talk about form, but still I will do basically object from it.
Yeah.
What is enough is that I am aware of it. That's I have to basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the attitude. But of course, if my approach is scientific, I am exploring it and investigating it, of course, I make object of it. I can, I think, switch the attitudes, and what I can do is basically follow it from the other point of view, which I think is the artistic one. This is not, but you know what, I can share, I have the quote which I didn't mention, but I will show you this because it helps, I think, understand something. This is this is from a book on music, you know what, on and this is this one, and this is Huron. This is what Huron does is that he discusses the ways in which in music is basically repose achieved, and this is what he says about Wagner. Yeah. This is the analysis of Wagner's treatment of classical cadence as a technique used in Western music to evoke repose. And Huron says, Wagner seems to love every aspect of the classical cadence except three: the resolution, the persistent reinforcing of a single key, area, and the tendency to interrupt the musical flow. In short, Wagner is attracted to the strong tending quality of cadential patterns, but repulsed by the evoking of closure or repose. He makes constant use of cadential elements while pointedly avoiding the actual cadence, the resolution. It would not be inappropriate to characterize this compositional practice as contra-cadential. So I think what is interesting here, what basically Huron says, that in art, one is interested in this repose just for, let's say, becoming's benefit.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was the idea. Yeah.
Okay, right. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you have another question, Pirmin.
Well, the point why I'm so interested in the difference between what we can talk about in a trans-situational way and what we can show only by reference to our subjective stance in time is that I think this is one of the topics which haunts philosophy from Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Zeno to Heidegger. I just want to combine or to bring together this approach, what Wojciech was talking about, with what we were talking about Heidegger and the history of philosophy, because all things which we can present in theories is relational and in a certain sense timeless. It's not eternal, as Jeff started saying this morning, but it's in form timeless, because mathematical relations are timeless, for example, and all relational talk are timeless. And so one of the big problems of metaphysical reflection or prima philosophia reflection on knowledge is the not only subjectivity and objectivity, but also time-dependent ways of telling what happens right now, what has happened, will happen, and generic and general knowledge of what happens as a form repeatedly and what is in relation to something else. And I think these tendencies are these two ways of referring to the world, namely empirically, subjectively, and scientifically in episteme, in standing sentences, and how they relate. It's not to say we always have only one, but we don't have the empirical way of talking, the narrative, without presupposing knowledge about eternal forms or standing sentences. And insofar, I think we could bring Wojciech's observation back to this problem. It's not so much saying what is the first, empirical or scientific or eternal or relational. We have to understand them in their relations, in their mutual dependencies and presuppositions.
Yeah,
And
I think you are right, and these are consequences one must explore. But basically, what the insight which I tried to formulate was relatively easy, and this is logical insight, that basically process is relation. And this is, of course, it's strange, but it is important, because if you just, for example, read Wittgenstein's Tractatus, what Wittgenstein notices that truth is relational, that unspeakability, they are on relational notions, substance irrelational are relational notions, but he phrases them from non-relational standpoint, and that's his problem. So the task, of course, is how to read relationality relationally, so in adequate fashion. Yeah, and this, I think, is basically the question of the absolute, and this is achievement. You know, is this not something which one can just write it down and say, okay, here it is.
I totally agree, but I have, in articulating that problem, I have always the problem to say that relations, a structure which is only relational, still doesn't have the notion of processual relational. So we have a static understanding of relations, and we have a processual understanding of relations, and the same holds for Wittgensteinian Tractatus. Even though he makes clear that it's relational, nevertheless, normally they start with the subject-predicate relation, where the predicate is not relational, but just a property. But there are no properties which are not the result of relations. Just like you do not have a property of numbers if you do not start with relations like being larger than the others. So I totally agree that the relation is primary, and the problem is when it comes to talking, then we cannot start with processes as actual processes. We must turn them into relations.
Exactly. I think that the process is a dangerous word, but and a relation not so
Exactly.
much, you know. So that's
Exactly. Exactly. Mhm.